Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. What a week it's been. What a couple of weeks it's really been for the Canadian government, for Prime Minister Mark Carney and his team. And we want to talk a little bit about that. In a previous podcast, we talked about the G7 meetings, which happened in Alberta a couple of weeks ago now. More recently, it's the NATO meetings that have gone on in The Hague and some of the commitments that Canada has made there. And it is significant when you look at some of the legislation that they passed. Of course, the big projects bill, that's what the people are calling it now, the one that passed just before the Parliament rose for the summer. But this is a big deal here, what the military spending that I want to talk about. And I've had a few people that have contacted us, and I always like to hear back from you, so thanks so much for that said, look, could you explain what the implications of Canada's commitment are? I'll tell you what I will do. We'll talk a little bit about this and maybe throw some numbers at you. A couple of things you got to keep in mind here. First of all, I am not an economist, although I've talked to them for the last 50 years on programs like this, so I got a little inkling of it. I did take economics in college, but that was a long time ago, and I don't think they even in those days anticipated what was happening here over the last couple of years. But we can go and crunch some numbers. The other element too is I hesitate to prognosticate here and say this is absolutely positively the impact this is going to have. I don't think anybody really knows that. What we can tell you is the commitment that Canada has now with this military spending to spend 5% of GDP on defense. It's not going to happen immediately. Is going to have a significant impact on the budget, the federal government budget, and by which extension on you and me. The money's got to come from someplace. And initially you might just think, well, okay, we're going to have to pay a lot more taxes. And that may be part of the solution. Let's not kid ourselves about this. But let's get to that. We'll circle back to that in just a couple of minutes. This is something that is not a new topic, and it's not simply directed at Canada. It's directed at a number of other NATO countries that were not coming up with, at that point, the NATO goal of 2% of GDP for defense spending. And Canada was one of the, well, as some critics said, one of the laggards, for better or for worse. We just didn't meet that target under the Trudeau government, but also under the Harper government. We did not meet those standards. And we always had our reasons and our excuses. And obviously a lot of the other NATO members didn't think they were legitimate numbers. And this is, by the way, not the first U.S. president, i.e. Donald Trump, that has pressured Canada and the others to come forward and spend more money. As one of the economists from the States talked about, I guess, when they were looking at the implications of this, he said, we've been asking nicely for the last 20 years, and we kept getting hums and haws. This guy here, we're not crazy about the way he did it, but he was forceful about it, and he did move NATO to action. Even the Secretary General of NATO praised Donald Trump for his pressure, I guess, to get Canada and other nations to come on side with this. And I want to make a point about that, okay? I have been a very strong critic, and I think justifiably so, of Donald Trump. I think he's a terrible president. I think he's a terrible person. And God help us all, because he's the leader of the most powerful country in the world these days. But this was the right thing to do. Not what he did, not the way he did it, but to get NATO spending up over the 5% mark. I don't know if that's necessarily the magic number, but it had to happen because the world situation has changed. And I don't know if Canada or other nations would have come on side with this had it not been for that. So we got to get over the fact that it was Trump that pushed for this. And that bothers me. It leaves a bad taste in my mouth, too. But it is what it is, and we're where we are with the spending, and now we got to talk about how Canada is going to come up with this and where it's going to go. And the numbers, as we said at the beginning of the podcast here, are large. Prime Minister Carney says that hitting that target, that 5% target, could cost Canada $150 billion a year. That's not chump change. We got to come up with that money someplace, and as I say, it's not going to happen right away. And by the way, if 5% is over the 10-year period, 3.5 of that is going to go to military procurements and things of this nature. The other 1.5% apparently is going to be focused on military infrastructure, roads, bridges, military bases, things like that. again, which experts have told us for years now have been underfunded and in disarray and in disrepair as far as the Canadian forces are concerned. I know they've made jokes about that, about not enough armaments to go around, etc. That's got to change. And Carney talked about that during the election campaign a couple of months ago, that it's about time. And part of that is also going to be wages and benefits for Canadian military personnel. And that's something that the government has been lagging behind in. One of the problems we've got here, if we're going to increase our commitment to NATO, whether it's going to be our northern defense or otherwise, is staffing. We don't have very many people in the military, not as many as we should, apparently. And that's because it's not a very attractive enterprise. It's not a very profession that people are drawn to these days for a whole lot of reasons. Some of it is because of some of the negative press that they've had, harassment, bullying, some of the other things that have gone on, or just plain low pay and lousy living conditions. That's got to change. Some people to look at this and say, that's a career alternative I might not have thought about. Maybe I can go into the military for a few years and get training in electronics or computer technology or IT, whatever the case might be, IT, and move on from there. And maybe people did that in the past. I know some people that did that. They did their 10 or 20-year run in the forces, retired, quote unquote, and went into the private sector with the training that they had. It's, I think, part of the goal of the government now to maybe get back into that thing. So we'll see how that plays out. But again, we're going to talk about those in the passage of time over the next little while about how those numbers are going to come out. But there is, I think, a need for this to happen. Look at what's happened in the Middle East. Look at what's happening with Ukraine. Look at what's happening with our northern border. And we tend to forget about this. You know, it's a news story for a couple of days, and then we get busy doing other things. But the fact of the matter is that we need to protect our assets to the north. We need to protect our trade routes in the north. I can remember way back in grade school talking about the Northwest Passage and the trade routes and, you know, having shipping going over there, and kind of forgot about that. But for better or for worse, because of global warming and the fact that the ice flows seem to have shrunk a little bit, a lot of countries, not just Canada, are looking to those northern passages for trade routes that might be less expensive than some of the stuff they have to do and going through canals in some of the more southern climes. And Canada has to be there. We can't just say, yeah, go ahead. I guess we don't have the wherewithal or the muscle to defend our sovereignty up there. We have to. And we can't simply say, well, you know, we've got the United States to the south. They'll do it for us because it's in their best interest. Trump has made it pretty clear, as have other presidents, that you can't always count on that. So we're going to have to lift our own weight here. And that's something that is long overdue. So that's part of this commitment. Now, what's going to happen here? Well, I'd hate to speculate that this means that, well, you're not going to have social programs anymore. You're not going to have dental plans anymore. The government is so far committed to all of those things. And there's going to have to be some very, very interesting discussions and very forceful discussions about what the priorities are going to be for this government. We've been in a financial conundrum before after the Mulroney government. I mean, we were in terrible debt. I mean, United Nations at one point declared Canada almost a third world economy. We were so far in debt without a whole lot of assets and it took the Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin government, Martin, of course, is the finance minister, to get us back on track and get us out of deficit situations. And it took some tough decisions. And a lot of people did not like what was going on, but it was, to use the phrase that economists love to use, it was tough medicine for the time. And this is what we're going to have to face again. So those are discussions and debates that are going to have to happen in Parliament. And of course, our own communities and around our kitchen tables, I guess, over the next little while, about just how this is going to roll out. Now, but it's got to be done. That's all there is to it. And you combine that with the other bill that was passed just before the summer recess for Parliament, and of course the big projects bill, and that means a lot of commitment, a lot of government spending. However, that element might actually help the military spending aspect of it. As we mentioned in a previous podcast, what Prime Minister Carney talked about was investing those infrastructure projects in projects that will give us a return on that are going to attract outside investment, that are going to actually pay for themselves over a period of time, so that will free up money. That's the plan. And that's the goal. And that's the attitude, I guess, that the government's going to take towards some of that. So I think we have to go into this with our eyes wide open, but it's not the dark, dystopian future that some people are painting this out to be, that we're going to be up to our eyes in debt and our taxes are going to go sky high. We have to accept what's going to happen here and accept the fact that there's going to be some increases. There may be some cutbacks in some programs and a reestablishment, I guess, of government priorities, which, by the way, they should be doing all the time anyway. And, maybe we've been stuck in neutral for so long that we have to kind of put it back in gear and see what's going on. The world is a different place, and we have to take our role in the reimagining, I guess, of our priorities, not just, of course, here at home, but, of course, on the international level as well. And what the Prime Minister is doing, what he did at G7, what he's done at the NATO meetings, I think is a step in the right direction. Polling that I saw just the other day indicated that I think it's something like 68 to 75% of the people that they've polled think the government's going in the right direction. That's a good sign. And I know it's early days. And, as some of these decisions are going to be made, and we may agree or disagree with some of them, those numbers may fluctuate. That's what happens when you're in government. But I'm reminded of a classic line from Winston Churchill when he was the Prime Minister in the UK way, way back. And he met a new member of Parliament, young guy that had just actually been elected, and met him in the hall and said, exchanged names. And he says, "Do you have political enemies?" And the young guy said, "Well, yeah, I do." And he says, "That's good." Says that means you've had the backbone to make decisions. And when you make decisions, some people will agree, some people are going to disagree. Fluctuating and obfuscating and sitting on the fence is not the way to govern. And that was Churchill's attitude, and I think it needs to be our attitude too. So we'll see how this rolls out. We'll also see, and this is another sidebar issue, which I think is going to be a very important issue to Canada that we want to talk about in more detail in the weeks ahead on the podcast, is what's going to be the impact between Canada and U.S. relations. Okay, Trump was on our case constantly about Canada and their military commitment. Carney has stepped up and said, yeah, we're with you. We got it. They've talked about the defense system, the Golden Dome, or whatever Trump's calling it this week. Carney said, yeah, we're on board. They're going to discuss how much it's going to cost, etc. But is that going to have an impact on our trade relations? Is that going to have an impact on the tariff situation? You'd like to think that with that kind of goodwill and that kind of commitment, that maybe Trump and his team would say, okay, let's cut these guys some slack right now because they clearly are on our side on some of these other key issues. My personal opinion, I don't trust Trump to do anything like that. I don't think he's a fair-minded individual. This is a guy that likes to win and conquer. He doesn't like to compromise and doesn't like to look at other people as allies. There's him, and then there's everybody below him. So I'm skeptical about whether or not this is going to have a positive impact on economic relations between the two countries. But I will reserve that judgment for now until we see some of the reaction from the United States in the weeks and months ahead. We are very close to that window that Carney and Trump had agreed upon to see whether or not they could get a deal. I don't know if there's been any progress on that at all. But as we've talked about in previous podcasts, when we talk about military spending and we talk about economics, they are not separate entities. Everything goes together into the same mix here. And that's all part of also not just the military spending and the commitment, but it's also part of the government relations between the two countries. Part of the whole thing about the G7 and NATO is not just, okay, you spend this, you spend this. It's about political friendships and political alliances. And Trump is not good at that. And that's going to hurt us if, in fact, he doesn't have a change of attitude, or at least some of the people around him don't have a change of attitude about that. So that's what we'd like to see happen. I'd like to think that's one of the things the government had in the back of their mind, that Prime Minister Carney had in the back of his mind when he was talking about making some of these deals. So let's give it a little time, let this settle, let it sink into us, and then maybe we'll get some sort of a reaction, hopefully a positive reaction from the U.S. government about what's going on here. But as far as Canada's commitment, I'm not going to get that trite cliche that governments always say that, hey, we're back. But Canada is back on the world stage. And we saw that over the last couple of months, not just because of Carney's actions and not because of his proposals, but the reception that he got at these meetings. As I say, he's not a newbie to international politics. They know him. He's has been friends for a long time with the Italian Prime Minister, with Macron, and with others that are part of these committees and these organizations. And that's a good step up. The relationship with the United States has been frosty over the last little while. I'd like to think that what's happened over the last couple of weeks especially might thaw some of that, but that's really kind of up to the guys south of the border, isn't it? We'll talk about that later on. That's all for this podcast. So glad that you were able to be with us today. If you are new, hey, great to have you on board. Thanks so much for this. You can pick us up anywhere where you get your podcasts, any one of the platforms. And by the way, as we post these, as these things drop hopefully on a daily basis now, we've also got some extra read-ons for you too, some background information about some of these topics. By all means, check that stuff out too. And give us your feedback, positive and negative. We want to hear back. This is all about creating a dialogue about these important decisions that we're making, not just for today, but for tomorrow as well. All right. Thanks as always to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.